Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to the NICE Economic Lecture Series. Through NICE Economic Lecture Series, we aim to invite eminent economists to discuss the contemporary economic issues. Before we start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is a research think tank registered under the Companies Act 2006 of Nepal, working towards bringing in research excellence in the field of international relations, international economy, security and development, and looking for better approaches to enhance international cooperation and relations for a better, peaceful and stable world. To talk about today's important topic, new experiments in public financial management, gender budgeting, we have Professor Lekha Chakraborty. Dr. Lekha Chakraborty is a professor at the National Institute of Finance and Policy, New Delhi, and elected member of the Governing Board of Management, International Institute of Economics. Please unmute yourself, participants. Let me continue. Dr. Lekha Chakraborty is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi, and elected member of the Governing Board of Management, International Institute of Public Finance, MUNIS, the World Association of Public Finance Economists. She is a pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India with Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, Government of India, 2004. She is also a research affiliate at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College, New York. Her areas of interest are macroeconomics of public finance, fiscal federalism, extractive sector economics, financing human development, and gender budgeting. She is the recipient of Infosys-based PhD thesis award from the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. She has worked for the IMF, World Bank, the UNESCAP, the UNDP, the UN Women, and the Commonwealth Secretariat on short stints. Her work experience in macro fiscal policy and human development spans across 8 countries: Sweden, Canada, Morocco, the Philippines, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Mexico, and more frequently in the Asia-Pacific region. She was twice an awardee of the Shastri Indo-Canada program from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Government of Canada. She was visiting professor at American University, Washington, D.C., Uppsala University, Sweden, Carleton University, Canada, and the University of Utah, US. She has papers in national and international journals. She is a columnist in the Indian Express, the Hindu, Financial Express, Business Line, Business Standards, The Wire, Hindustan Times, and Scroll, and featured in CNBC, ANI, DD News, Air World, Air Service, and Rajya Sabha. Professor Chakraborty, you have around 35 to 40 minutes to make your initial remarks, which will be followed by the questions and answers. This session is of 60 minutes and the program is streaming live on several Facebook pages and social media platforms. We would like to request all our participants to tweet about the event and also share our live video on their social media so that maximum can benefit from the discussion. The audience can drop in their questions under the Facebook Live or Zoom chat. Now, Professor Chakraborty, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Chaudhary, for inviting me. And Kathmandu, it's a very special place for me because this gender budgeting experiment in our region, the first regional meeting was in Kathmandu. So we, NIPFP, when we did that pioneering study, we went there. Then Professor Meena Acharya, you must be knowing her. She's one of the, significant scholars who contributed to the field of macro and gender. So it was an amazing experience. First things, you never forget in your life. So Kathmandu, I remember for that matter, where the regional conference held first on gender budgeting. And things moved, and that's exactly the challenges and the experiments I'm going to share with you right now. And in the beginning, in our region, when gender budgeting was incorporated into the public financial management, those times it was not normal like this, that a finance minister could connect to the, area of gender, because those times the question which came up were, can a rape happen in the city? What exactly finance minister can do about it? In the intra-household, when there is tension, when there is domestic violence, what exactly can finance minister talk about that? And when there is, anthropometric data which shows that there is intra-household nutrition issues, then what exactly, prime minister and finance minister of the country talk about these issues? Because these are very micro, issues. What exactly do you want? So these were the kind of the questions we faced in the beginning. How can gender be a macro subject? So that was, of course, a revolution, an international working group on gender and macro. So they have taken up this issue to integrate gender budgeting and the other kinds of gender perspectives in the macro policy making, not only in the fiscal policy, but in the monetary policy and also in the trade policies. So that revolution happened like this. And over the years, we have seen that this has become normal, and finance minister and the finance ministry is able to cope up with the issues which relate to women and take it as one of the priorities of the government. So that journey was quite fulfilling, but miles to go in terms of doing these experiments. That's what exactly you asked me to talk about. This gender budgeting, it's a fiscal innovation. And like any other innovation, this innovation has to transfer or to travel through four important phases. In the sense, the innovation starts with knowledge building and the exact model building specific to a country. Then to translate that model into a public policy making, you need to have proper institutions. So that was another challenge. So the first part of the gender budgeting was to create a model which is specific to country, incorporating the gender diagnosis and the gender inequality issues. Then translating that concerns into the public policy making requires the institutional framework. Then after going through this knowledge building, the model building, and the institutional framework, the next challenge was capacity building. At the center and the state levels, we need to build a capacity to translate this, beautiful experiment to implement properly, so that the men and women benefit from this. And the last part is, how accountable is this exercise? Of course, it's a fiscal innovation. So how accountable it is this? So what are the accountability mechanisms we need to build in to translate this experiment into an accountable and transparent fiscal exercise? So that was a journey which happened in 4 phases. And as I mentioned in the Kathmandu meeting, that was prior to the global goals like SDG. Now we have a global framework to talk about, the matters relating to human development, which is a beyond economic growth paradigm. But those times when the gender budgeting framework began, that was prior to the SDG framework. So when there was no global goal, SDGs were not there, then gender budgeting acted as a public financial management tool that's exactly for fiscal transparency and accountability to translate the gender concerns into budgetary commitments. And of course, planning process is also equally involved in that process. In that case, in that fiscal innovation, the challenging phase was to measure the outcomes. Because as I mentioned, we cannot, just stick on to economic growth paradigm to talk about gender budgeting, because, everything is not getting translated into human development. The moment a country, Nepal or India, grow in terms of economic growth. So it was a beyond GDP paradigm. So that was the first, revolution or the first transition that has happened. Then the next challenge was macroeconomic framework itself. If you look into the fiscal and monetary policy framework, these framework are quite fixed in terms of rules. And in terms of rules, when it is fixed, so what exactly you can do to integrate the concerns related to, the gender budgeting. A macroeconomic framework is fixed in the sense, inflation targeting, which decides the price stability of your country, and that's the basic objective of the center bank. So there, integrating gender has not yet happened. And on fiscal policy side, rules-based fiscal economics we have based on the fiscal rules of the 3% to GDP is the deficit, and we need to maintain that deficit even if we go through expenditure compression or tax buoyancy. That target was fixed at 3% those time. So when there was a rules-based macroeconomic framework, integrating gender into macro policy making was a big concern. So these two challenges: one, to shift the paradigm beyond economic growth; second, how to tackle the strict macroeconomic framework to integrate the gender concerns. So there, this gender budgeting acted as a new policy tool to integrate the questions related to gender inequalities into the fiscal policy framework. Now comes the question of COVID, the context of COVID, where a lot of economic stimulus packages were announced as a part of the economic, pandemic package. But those economic stimulus packages, when those things were short-run in nature, what exactly we need to do to make it into the long term to tackle the problems related to the economic inequalities, which gets translated into gender inequalities, or which get, influenced by the gender, gender inequalities. What I meant is income inequalities add upon to gender inequality. So all these inequalities gets accumulated. So when economic stimulus package is short-run in nature, we need to have a long-term policy tool, a PFM tool like gender budgeting to tackle this issue. Now, as I mentioned earlier, outcome measures became a crucial issue. And we have taken, that paradigm from the gender neutral indicators to gender sensitive indicators by incorporating that equally distributed equivalent approach to come up with a composite index. So that's a way the outcome was measured. Now, then, there was a question of methodology. These experiments, excuse me, are not easy. Methodology was a major concern. Finance ministry, excuse me, or any planning division, when they look into these new experiments, they want everything to be quantified into numbers. But the way the gender budgeting or the gender inequality issues were dealt with in the country was more or less qualitatively. The approach or the methodology was qualitative. So the question was, we don't want to hear the human stories, which is cruel, but we want to know what's the impact of fiscal policy on gender outcomes in terms of numbers, and what is that quantitative framework you can put forward to do this experiment. That was a challenge. Excuse me. So our articulation was that in terms of methodology, it has to be a Q-square approach. Qualitative and quantitative methodology are very crucial to understand the matters related to the gender inequalities in the country or in region. So that was a challenge. It was quite a bit of a debate that happened that human storytelling cannot be a methodology for gender budgeting. Then at the end of the day, you come to a consensus that one story, a compelling story told by a woman in the village is worth running millions of regressions. So everything in terms of the planning models or the finance models will not give you the perspectives which you need to work with when you talk about the matters related to gender inequality. So these challenges related to macroeconomic framework, shifting the paradigm beyond economic growth, then talking about the measurement in terms of the gender outcomes, composite or simple indicators, and the methodology, whether it has to be quantitative or qualitative. So these were the challenges, as scholars we faced in the beginning when we talk about gender budgeting. Now, things are quite easy because the methodology is accepted more or less qualitative and quantitative. And one of the important methodologies which was given emphasis those times was public and benefit incidence analysis. In the sense, you have unit cost and unit utilized to arrive at the benefit incidence. So when you look into the effectiveness or the efficacy of public spending on reducing the gender inequalities, These exercises in terms of gender disaggregated benefit incidence analysis was quite helpful in the sense they gave us a picture of what is happening across income quintiles, across gender, across socioeconomic groups, and we were able to identify whether there was an elite capture in terms of this incidence in public spending. So those methodology was quite crucial. Now, how to integrate into the policy making, what are the institutional mechanisms required. So it happened in most of the countries as an ex post analysis by applying a gender lens to the existing budget, because those times we didn't know how much a country is spending on women. So it started as an ex post exercise, as they defined gender budgeting as applying a gender lens to the existing budgets. So that's the way it happened. Then, with the advent of fiscal decentralization in many countries, it was taken to the subnational governments, of course, using the principle of subsidiarity. And of course, by accepting the fact that, this many decisions need to be taken at the level which is closest to the people, fiscal decentralization became a platform for introducing gender budgeting at the local levels. So those experiments were quite powerful in terms of integrating ex-ante gender budgeting experiments. And ex post, as I mentioned, you apply a gender lens to the existing budget. Ex-ante is like you identify a gender need in a jurisdiction. Then using the costing methodologies and using a very detailed, elaborative consultation process, you will come up, or you will arrive at a planning and the budgeting and the costing methodologies to arrive at a consensus how this can be integrated into the next budget cycle. So that was very important, because ex post gender budgeting analysis, for many years in different countries proved that gender budgeting as a percentage of the total budget is not going up. It is just becoming stagnated. So how to go ahead from those stagnated numbers? So there, ex-ante gender budgeting became very crucial by identifying the gender needs of a country by tagging the budget codes to those gender goals. So that is ex-ante gender budgeting. In addition to the ex post and ex-ante gender budgeting, in many countries, it was taken up as a fiscal marksmanship issue. In the sense, it is correlated to the budget credibility. Because I mentioned that gender budgeting is a powerful tool of budget transparency and accountability. So from that perspective, fiscal marksmanship analysis was very crucial to look into the budget credibility issues related to gender inequality as well. Excuse me. So in those experiments, what exactly is fiscal marksmanship? Finance minister can announce many programs, but that doesn't mean that it is backed up by proper allocations. So we need to see the programs were just around the political economy, or whether it is getting translated into better gender outcomes. So that was very crucial. That's why fiscal marksmanship needs to be looked into. Excuse me. And it is possible to do technically to understand what is a fiscal marksmanship. In the sense, you take out the budget estimates, then after 1 year, you look into the actual spending, then you will be able to know where there is any significant deviation between what your government promised and what actually they delivered. And if there is a deviation, excuse me, if there is any deviation, then you need to look into the sources of fiscal forecasting errors. And in many studies, the fiscal forecasting errors were looked upon, and the reasons for this forecasting errors was identified as random. If it's random, then you will not be able to, understand what is the source of error, and it is beyond the capacity of the public policy maker to look into those errors. But if the source of fiscal forecasting is not random, then the question is whether the bias of the policy maker is getting into these equations, And then if the bias of the policymaker is getting into in the assumptions or in the models, then you need to correct for that. So gender budgeting from the fiscal marksmanship perspective, from the budget credibility perspective were looked into. So these were the different experiments. Now, once you understand this budget issues, are we okay? Okay. So when we get into this fiscal, credibility issues, the budget credibility issues, then the question is, institutions are available in your country to look into this budget credibility. Whether it's gender budgeting or general budgeting, fiscal councils, across globe in several countries, fiscal councils have taken up this question of budget credibility. And in many countries, fiscal council is not there. So it is that political economy of gender budgeting is not looked into. Now, what exactly is the mandate in which gender budgeting is floated in a country is also very important. In addition to shifting the economic growth paradigm, as I mentioned, working with the macro fiscal constraints in the framework and looking into the outcome measures and to link between the fiscal policy and the outcome. We're looking into ex ante and ex post and benefit incidents. So in addition to all these things, the political economy is very relevant, and how you mandated the question of gender budgeting in a country is quite relevant. So in many countries, this experiment happened through legal mandate. But in many countries, it happened as a fiscal mandate, not backed up by any legal provisions or laws. So what is the factor, or what is a determinant for the sustainability of gender budgeting exercises? Of course, the legal mandate is one of the determinant, a powerful, a significant determinant for the sustainability of gender budgeting exercise. Because otherwise, gender budgeting exercise became just a donor-driven exercise. Now we need to look into the question whether UN women exist or not in a country supporting with finance to do gender budgeting. It has to be a sustained process. So that question was very relevant when donor presence was there to initiate the gender budgeting. So we need to go ahead from the donors to integrate the gender budgeting experiments within the budgetary framework of the country. So that was very crucial. Then the scholars within the country, they talked about the sustainability exercise, but otherwise, whether Commonwealth Secretariat or UN Women, when they stopped funding these gender budgeting initiatives, then it became unsustainable. So those were challenges that every time a donor cannot support an experiment, a PFM experiment. Now, in 2016, there was a huge announcement by IMF that all the member nations need to integrate gender budgeting in the PFM framework. So that's a long-term or sustainable way in which we need to look into. Otherwise, UN Secretary General in 2016, in the high-level panel meetings, one of the important tools to go ahead with the gender, equality goals or the women economic empowerment was gender budgeting. It was identified as one of the important policy tools. So that is one of the sustainable framework. So these are sustainable announcements, but otherwise, if it is finance driven or if it is donor driven, then those experiments became unsustainable. So that is very important. Now, I mentioned about the legal mandate. We need to look into how it has happened across countries from the legal mandate. In Korea, gender budgeting was incorporated into the national finance law. So when it is incorporated into the national finance law, then it is sustainable because all the articles related to the different pieces of or the different components of the PFM was incorporated into the legal framework, starting from the financial inputs, linking the financial inputs to the outcomes and also the fiscal marksmanship. So that was legally mandated. In Philippines, it was legally mandated as an earmarking. Like from all the developmental sectors, you need to earmark a specific portion of, the budget for gender equality concerns. Like from all the developmental sectors in Philippines, they were asked to earmark around 5% of the budget for the gender equality concerns. So that was another way. In India and in many countries, it happened through budget call circular. That's a beginning of a budget cycle. So through the call circulars or the budget circulars, you were asked, the sectoral ministries were asked to come up with the gender-related budgeting or gender budgeting when they, what you call submit their demand for grants. So that was also legal, but it happened through a different manner in the form of budget call circulars. So these are the different ways in which it happened. Otherwise, if we look into other social policy experiments, the legal mandate happened in a different sense. For example, when a country floats, the employer of last resort policies by guaranteeing job to the poor people, then the legal provisioning is coming from the perspective of public interest litigation. In the sense, you need to guarantee 100 days employment for people, and if you fail to do that, you can take it up as a legal issue from the public interest litigation perspective. But not even in a single country that, it became a political economic question where the women and men in each household, became aware of the policy tool called gender budgeting. And they can speak to the government if they fail in their perspectives, objectives, and duties in terms of gender budgeting they promise to the people, and they can take it up as a public interest litigation issue. So that kind of a revolution where the unit of analysis is intra-household, and the intra-household, every woman in your country is aware of gender budgeting as a policy tool for her say in the government, that kind of revolution is yet to happen. And maybe that's a second generation reforms that can happen in terms of gender budgeting. But those kind of legal backup as a mandate, legal mandate, or the public interest litigation, or the awareness about the gender budgeting by all the women in the country, that has not happened. So that may be the next, level reforms that can happen for gender budgeting. Or what has happened from the legal mandate is you look into the question of earmarking. By legal mandate, you are supposed to earmark 5% of the entire budget for gender inequality concerns. So that's the way it happened. Otherwise, in the intergovernmental fiscal framework, when we talk about gender budgeting, it's not really just confined to the public expenditure of the national or subnational governments, but it also in terms of the fiscal federalism framework, in terms of the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. So there, in most of the countries, the money is transferred from the higher level of the government to the lower level of the government in terms of a scientific formula. And in many countries, it is based on population, area, and many socioeconomic backwardness indicators may get into this scientific formula to transfer the money to the lower levels of the government. But the question was, can we integrate a formula or a criterion relate to the gender concerns in this tax transfer formula, so that in the subnational governments which are not taking care of the gender inequality concerns may get money less. So money speaks. So can it be a method in which we can integrate gender inequality concerns into intergovernmental fiscal framework? That was another question. Now, gender budgeting experiments doesn't stop at experiment doesn't stop at international intergovernmental fiscal transfers or the public expenditure concerns. It also get into the taxation side. And if you look into the taxation side, of course, as I mentioned, tax transfer is given on the basis of the formula, and can gender criteria be incorporated into tax transfer? That could be one question. The other question, can tax policy lead to increase in the entitlements of women? So when we try to answer that question, a differential taxation was quite crucial to address these concerns. Like, if a woman is registering for the property, can there be a differential tax system for her, or the tax rates can be lower if a woman, what you call register for a property? So those kind of concerns are there, and in many jurisdictions, those questions were taken up and looked into, and that's working because it is leading to increase in the entitlement of the women, because that women where out of the financial inclusion or the financial sector was primarily due to lack of collateral. So these kind of taxation experiments can, support her with the collateral. So then she can also engage into the financial, imperatives or the financial experiments. But overnight, the microfinance programs or the financial inclusion experiments could not make a poor woman and micro entrepreneur overnight, but it can lead to social empowerment if she can come out and based on the peer monitoring models, if she can be with her peers, talking about her concerns, not only about the finance concerns, but also about the intra household tensions and all, that kind of process can give her exposure and a support that something exists beyond her intra-household dynamics. So those kind of experiments can lead to the agency in women, and that can also lead to increase in the power relations or increase in the voice she can exercise when it comes to the intra-household power relations. And that is closely related to the gender-based violence as well, the domestic violence as well. Now you can ask me a question: what exactly the experiment need to be done by the government, which can tackle the violence that is happening intra-household? Can government look into the matters related to intra-household experiments? But when there is social prejudice, and that is leading to even the issues like the young girls are preferring to be preferring to be away from those kind of toxic relations by even even they commit suicide. So that's a way the women are unable to tackle the issues related to the domestic violence. So in order to come out of it, they even commit suicide. So these questions were quite crucial in terms of a empowered state like Kerala in the context of India. So Kerala, if you look into the indicators for health and education, the literacy rate is quite high. And if you look into the health indicators, IMR is as low as 4 per 1 lakh live births. So when you look into the indicators like suicide rates and domestic violence, of course, in the state was not doing well. So the finance minister, when he had a meeting to brainstorm what exactly needs to be done, if using this promising framework of gender budgeting to tackle these issues, then the questions of related to the domestic violence were also taken up. And in South Africa, domestic violence, that's a legal, there is a law on domestic violence. So how to back up or how to implement those legal provisions? So what are the budgetary commitments to support that? So that was a gender budgeting experiment which was done in South Africa. So in Kerala, South Africa, in many countries, you look into these questions, beyond health and education, you can look into these issues from the perspective of gender equality outcomes and short stay homes. Because the first question is, if you're facing something within the family from the close relatives, then the first thing is to move out. Women may not have a space to move out, so the short stay homes and state machinery supporting the women who is experiencing the domestic violence, so that lead to reduction in the domestic violence. And the study by University of California that showed that inverse relationship between the gender budgeting and domestic violence. So it is empirically proved that it is plausible that you can support. So there are different experiments you can do by using gender budgeting as a tool for social justice. So you need to understand the different concerns or the capability deprivation of women or the unfreedoms of women, and then you map it into planning and the budgetary commitment. So in that way, gender budgeting is an ex ante important framework or important experiment to be looked into, rather than we focus our energy only to look into what exactly exists in a country by applying a gender lens into a existing budget framework or existing budget. So that is very crucial to get the fiscal transparency exercise. But in order to experiment gender budgeting framework, because it's a policy framework, is very promising, to use it as a tool of social justice, you need to do more experiments over there. So in addition to this ex ante and ex post exercise, in addition to the budget credibility exercise by using this for the fiscal marksmanship and the budget credibility, now you have to get to the question of political economy. And when the budget allocations are closely correlated with the calculus of consent of people, because many experiments you run in a country to incentivize the people's mandate, that political economy also was looked into, and many political parties they use gender inequality concerns as one of the prime objectives when they were talking to the people when they ran for elections. So gender budgeting policy tool can also enter as a political economy policy tool by looking into the questions related to the calculus of consent. And those are the things we need to look into, so that it will not be a detached technical exercise, but gender budgeting can become a political statement. And the political the political parties can look into those questions and then promise that's a way it can be democratized. Otherwise, gender budgeting is just a technical tool. And my last point is, whatever happens, whether legal fiat or the fiscal fiat, the gender budgeting experiments will be successful only if gender inequality concerns will be taken up by the highest policy making body in the country, or at the highest cabinet level, or at the prime minister or the presidential level. So in many Pacific islands, you can see that gender budgeting or the status of women, that office is with the highest policy making body. So it's not a sectoral ministry which looks into the questions related to the women. So that policy prioritization is very crucial for the sustainability, and gender budgeting has to be identified as one of the promising policy tools at the highest policy making body and the highest cabinet level or the president level. That priority needs to be there. In Australia, that priority is there. Like if you look into the status of women, that office, it's the highest level of the government, or that's a way the prioritization needs to be done. Otherwise, you will end up in asking the stereotype questions that when a country pass through a macroeconomic crisis, we need to tackle the crisis first, and then only we can look into matters related to women. So that's a way we are blind and myopic related to the women's issues, because when there is macroeconomic crisis, we need to know that the women, they bear the brunt of the macroeconomic crisis in the country. So gender budgeting and the gender, that's a macro concern. It's not a micro concern, and it has to be prioritized. And that's the first acknowledgement that needs to be done to take the other bold step, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of using this gender budgeting as a fiscal innovation framework. Thank you. And over to you, Professor Chowdhury, that we can open the floor right now for questions. Thank you so much. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Professor Chakraborty, for comprehensive and interesting presentation on new experiments in public financial management, gender budgeting. We have learned a lot from this lecture, and we have received some questions here through personal messages and chat. And I will also open floor for the participants. If they have any questions, they can raise their hands. For now, I will just get the questions from the chat. Ma'am, there is some questions. Let me put it. Why do felt the need to discuss gender budgeting? That's the first question. Like, why do you feel the need of discuss gender budgeting? And does gender budgeting have to be done for the whole budget, or in which area can be gender budgeting be implemented? Let's first answer these questions, and then we will go through other questions.
Wonderful question. It's back to the base.
Yeah, please go on.
Yeah, that question is, the first question is the need for gender budgeting. The rationale is like, it has got equality concerns, equity concerns, it has got a dimension of human rights perspectives and also efficiency. So, finance minister, when he talked about gender budgeting or she talked about gender budgeting, it was primarily from an efficiency perspective. Like, if we do this, what is that macroeconomic benefit we can get? So, if women are empowered, if the fastest and smartest way to develop a country is incorporating women.
प्रोजेक्ट के हिसाब से जो एरिया है वो स्पेसिफिकेशन वो तो अपडेट स्टैंडर्ड ही है ना.
Participants, please unmute yourself. Once the professor will end answers, then you can ask your questions. Please unmute yourself. Mute yourself for now. Yeah, please, ma'am, go.
Yeah, so that's a concern. So the efficiency, that's of course it's only one side, but we always look into the question, like if you incorporate gender budgeting, then what is that benefit for the nation as a whole, for the macroeconomic economy as a whole? Then my answer to that concern is, economy is not only what you can measure and what you can perceive. There are a lot of things in the economy which you cannot measure and which is statistically invisible. For instance, you have 8 hours work and you get a remuneration, and that's incorporated into the GDP, and many other economic activities are incorporated in the GDP. But the concern or the work of men and women in the statistically invisible care economy sector, which is unmonetized and unpaid, we policymakers don't have a mood to look into those questions, because we take that sector for granted. That economy will run and somebody else will support us like this. Whether we keep those segment of population vulnerable or not, the economy is going to develop and we will go ahead. So we have to ask a question: economy is developing for whom? Are we keeping a segment of people vulnerable? Are there people who are tired looking into the many questions? They have time stress. Are they supporting what is happening in the economy because somebody else is supporting? That's why we could sit here and discuss. There are many elements in this economy needs to be supported so that the proper functioning can happen. So those sector, basically care economy sector we mentioned, we took that sector for granted, that men and women in that sector will do that job, do those economic activities unremunerated, without any appreciation, without any recognition for long. And that stress, that time poverty started affecting income poverty. So when country comes up with the programs like employer of last resort, like come, we guarantee you employment, then if you look into the access statistics, the women who access those programs which were promised by the government, there was differentials in the data across men and women. Then we understood that it is not only the employment policy that is required for tackling the income poverty, but we need to look into the questions related to time stress and time poverty. And that's coming up as a new experiment or a new data collection in terms of asking the chronology of time and the time stress and trying to incorporate that into the macro policy making, because that's very crucial. Otherwise, if you don't look into these issues and if you ask only about the efficiency of the economy, then you are not getting the economy at that efficient level, which you can get otherwise if you look into the both segments of the economy, which is a statistically invisible care economy and the market economy, or that kind of monetized sector. So if you look into only the monetized sector and talk about the efficiency and economic welfare, you're partial, you're myopic. But if you focus, the policymakers focus on that both segments, the overall economic well-being and the economic growth can be assured, or it can be doubled. So the fastest and smartest way to develop intelligent ministers and intelligent finance minister and prime minister or the president will be able to understand that it is through increasing the women's labor force participation, because so much of talents and insights were not just, it is not there just because of the time poverty, which we need to look into. So that's about the efficiency. Then equity perspective. What's the basic role of a public policy? It is to decide, to tackle the economic growth issues alone, Because when the economy progresses, why everybody, based on the equal opportunity paradigm, why everybody is coming and accessing the public service provisioning equally in terms of health and education? If you look at the access statistics, so you need to frame certain policies which can remove those kind of unfreedoms or those barriers of the people, so that everybody can participate in the economy and the avail or enjoy the public service provisioning. Otherwise, in Morocco there was an experiment that they wanted to increase the labor force, the enrollment rates of ratio of girls' education, the gross enrollment ratio. But when they increased the education budgets, they couldn't. But they increased the water budgets, they could. Because the primary responsibility in any society to ensure clean fuel and clean water is women and children. So when the government, they were open to these concerns, and they supported the deficiency in the public infrastructure related to water and fuel, then enrollment went up. So it is not only those complementary fiscal services that's very crucial to look into. Another experiment is, ensuring clean fuel for the house is the responsibility of women. And if you provide gender budgeting in energy infrastructure, that can help, poor women, right? Poor women, right? Otherwise, in that setup of what you call the poor ventilation in that house, making, food for her children using that bad fuels, like whatever she collected from the forest or from the neighboring neighborhood, using that with that poor ventilation, if she is cooking food for her children, we will be ashamed to say that the mortality rates or the morbidity rates of that indoor air pollution or that respiratory diseases that happen for the women and children due to this process is quite huge, and it is worse than the people, women and children affected by malaria. So what is the gender budgeting needs to be looked into in energy infrastructure? So these answers are related to the question, the second question, that scholar has asked me, asking about what are the areas in which we can do gender budgeting. Of course, we need to go ahead from education and health. Even infrastructure, it was a huge debate. Infrastructure is gender neutral, what gender budgeting you can do in infrastructure. But as I mentioned, there are different fields in which you can go ahead with experimenting that energy infrastructure gender budgeting, or physical infrastructure also in the roads. It's very important. Otherwise, if you look into the concerns of maternal mortality, you must be knowing the 3 delays model, which is published in the British Journal. Like first delay, the women have to accept that she have to perceive that she is unwell. So that's one delay. Second is the close relative needs to take her to the hospital. And third is infrastructure. And the fourth is like the availability of doctors and the health professionals in that place where she is taken to. So in order to decrease the maternal mortality rate, what are the gender budgeting experiments you need to look into in a commune or a jurisdiction or a village? The questions related to these delays needs to be looked upon, rather than just focusing on one aspect of it. So there are different ways in which you can go ahead with incorporating gender budgeting, and these were the quick examples that came to my mind. Then another area about the violence in the city, the rapes happening in the city. So you can ask me a question that what exactly government can do about it. But the government can always come up with the gender budgeting experiments related to the security and safety of women, because most of the things are happening in the public transport in a public place. So if that is happening in a public transport in a public space, then of course it's a public policy failure. You cannot ask that why the girl was after sunset. No, you have to accept that it's a public policy failure. The moment you accept that it's a public policy failure, it's your duty to plan and budget the matters related to the safety and security of women. And as I mentioned earlier, these experiments will happen only if the priority of a particular government or the party in power gives to gender budgeting. So if that priority is not given to gender budgeting, then everything else regarding the technicalities and the political economy will fail. That prioritization is quite crucial to identify the areas in which gender budgeting can be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lekha Chakraborty. Dear participants, if you have any questions, please raise your hand or you can drop your questions in the chat box. Okay, let me take the questions from the chat box then. There's questions like, what are the realistic approach to gender budgeting looks like? How does gender budgeting work, especially in South Asia? And what are the gender budgeting approaches in South Asia? And what are the legal framework to promote gender budgeting? And there's one question from the Chandrika. He has asked, like, would you please highlight on how gender responsive budgeting can effectively be implemented at local level in countries like Nepal? So it's all in South Asian context. So I will, yeah, please enlighten on this.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chandrika. These questions are related, of course, as Professor Chaudhary mentioned, the South Asian experiments. So I will take a minute to explain what has happened in Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, a quick or maybe a general trend or the common things I can talk to you about these experiments. Let's start with Nepal. Nepal, the gender budgeting experiment happened as a scoring method. So they identified several indicators, also incorporating the time use, survey or the time use statistics. So only Nepal, if you look around, only Nepal has incorporated the time use, the relevance of time use into the gender budgeting. So based on the scoring methodology, Nepal has gone ahead with gender budgeting. Scoring in the sense they identified different, aspects related to the gender to be looked into, including the statistically invisible care sector, and then they do a score. And based on that, of course, it is criticized as a little bit of subjectivity. It can come in when we look into the budgetary classification and start the scoring methods based on the gender inequality concerns. But of course, otherwise the experiments opposite or the other alternative was to look into the existing budgetary framework and to apply a gender lens. So in India, what has happened is that within the existing budgetary framework, you applied a gender lens at the center government level. There, the nuances which Nepal captured through incorporating the different elements of the subjectivity of the gender budgeting, that is not there. So whether you need to be objective or subjective is the question number one. Second, whether you need to be within the public financial management or the budgetary classification of a country and experiment gender budgeting, or you need to frame a different kind of classification for the gender budgeting. So this was the second question. And third, how it was implemented. It was implemented not only at the national level, but also at the subnational levels. In Bangladesh, of course, it started as an exposed framework, but the huge civil society networks that helped, a lot of experiments to be done from the outside government level as well. But if you look at the sustainability exercise, in which all South Asian countries, the gender budgeting was supported by the Ministry of Finance, they sustained because they incorporated these experiments within the budgetary framework. But in some countries, when it happened through outside government initiative, like demystifying the budget through a gender lens, which was prepared by the civil society organizations. So that is like democratizing the budget process, making the budget transparent for the mass. And we were talking to the women to understand that this is a way government spent money for women and men. So that articulation was there, but the experiments to incorporate into the budgetary framework, those experiments were sustainable when the government took it up and when it was a within government exercise. And in Sri Lanka, right now, that because of that financing of deficit that happened mainly through the external sources, now the country is facing, a lot of instability issues. You understand that what the country is going through. But prior to that, when we looked into this gender budgeting exercise, the first experiment in Sri Lanka happened through the Commonwealth Secretariat, because the Commonwealth Secretariat came up with experimenting gender budgeting in 5 countries around the world, and one was Sri Lanka. And they used, as I mentioned earlier, the public benefit incidence analysis to look into the question of elite capture or a benefit capture that is happening in any sectors, that was a question they asked. And their like trade component is very high. The women in the external sector, the women working, that is very high. So those kind of focus were given to the experiments that has happened in Sri Lanka. It's just like Philippines. In Philippines also, that experiments in certain communes, the absence of mother in the house, because the mother is going to the cities to tackle the care economy concerns, because she was hired by people in the city. So she is away from her home. So the absence of mother in her own village or in her own commune, in her own family, what kind of psychological issues or the societal issues that is creating in the Philippines commune because of that. Because you understand that many empirical studies showed that the Filipino women go out for work as nannies. So when the gender experiment, the gender budgeting experiment in that commune was to prevent the women from going out, then they try to look into what are the existing sectors in which we can revamp those investment so that this exodus of women from her own family can be avoided. So that was looked into. And in other places, employer of last resort provided guaranteed jobs in public works, but the women were not comfortable or willing to come for public works. It's basically public works was ensured, through this job guarantee schemes or employer of last resort schemes. So what she wanted was that, for instance, in some villages, she may be knowing the skill of weaving, world class things she can weave, but her skills were not given a platform or a market, so that she can what do you call use her talents to that's a passion, as well as it can be an income generation activity. So those kind of gender budgeting experiments happen in certain local level jurisdictions, in which what is the innate intrinsic ability or the passion of a woman, support that. If weaving is the main the thing which a woman does in that particular village, then encourage that as a part of gender budgeting, so that the outcome or the output they generate will also be of world class. So these kind of experiments related to what women want. So basically the mapping of the gender needs and the revealed preferences of women is very important prior to the gender budgeting experiment. So these were the different ways in which it was done. Then in Sri Lanka, they have taken to the local level governments as well. And, I have done a study over there in the beginning, and the language constraint was there, and language, then the vernacular languages, these models were translated, and they started experimenting at the local governments, those models. And now we have reached up to a stage in which we cannot de-link gender budgeting and climate budgeting, the climate responsive budgeting. And it is very crucial for Nepal. And Nepal is one of the pioneers in our South Asian region who went ahead with the climate responsive budgeting. So within that climate responsive budgeting, what is the gender budgeting elements, the gender lens you applied, it's crucial to analyze. Otherwise, it will be a watertight compartment. Like in the 80s, we looked into poverty budgeting. In 90s, we looked into gender budgeting. Now in 2000, in this century, we will look into the climate related risk and uncertainties. Then it will be a watertight compartment, because these are overlapping. So we need to look into these things in correlation, or it has to be a comprehensive package to look into the climate and the gender concerns together. So these are the ways in which quickly I mentioned about the experiments that has happened in South Asia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, ma'am. There is one question from Lekha Chakraborty. Her question is, suppose a government of a country adopted a free market policy and will allow private sectors, and many development economists claim that the free market create inequality in the society. So then the question is the corporate tax is the best way redistribution? That's the one question. And there is another question from the Alok Tripathi. At present, gender budgeting is very crucial. So what is the implementation in the context of South Asia that you have already, I think, covered it all? And is the concerned authority mentally ready to implement to bring real outcome? Let's
good.
first go with these two questions, ma'am.
Thank you, Chakraborty, right? Chakraborty and yeah.
Alok Tripathi.
Yeah, thank you for those brilliant questions. So, in the first question on the taxation side, business taxation, of course, you are right, because state business relations, that's a very crucial thing to be looked into. Otherwise, I'm aware of the kind of deals that can happen in the society and how that can create inequalities in the system. And those inequalities will, add up to gender inequality. So inequality question, when we talk about inequality, that question needs to be analyzed from different perspectives. First is how inequality or the equality is guaranteed by the constitution of your country. Second, how these income inequalities are, strengthening or getting increased in your country. Then third, how the lack of constitutional support and these, mounting income inequalities are getting into or feeding into the gender inequality. Because gender inequality construct is, not a island one. It is closely correlated to how a constitution envisions equality of citizens in a country and of course, the income inequality. So when inequality, gender equality is taken up from this framework, as you mentioned, the state business relation is very crucial. And in the state business relation, of course, that what you extract from the society, what is that payment you are giving back to the government for extracting from the society or extracting the natural resource taxation or anything. So that question is very relevant. And corporate tax in South Asia, in India and all, we were notorious for very high corporate tax in the world. So the tax incidence studies theoretically showed that the impact of or the incidence of the corporate tax is more on labor than capital. So that's a way theory talks about the incidence of corporate tax. But there are many empirical evidence which refute this thesis and which prove that it's on capital more than labor. So we need to understand first at the macro level the incidence of the corporate tax in the country before we integrate the gender budgeting into the corporate tax models. So first we need to know that incidence. So in India, recently there were studies which proved that it's on the capital. If that is the case, we need to understand the effective tax incidence of the capital entrepreneurs. Who is paying the corporate tax? Where is the burden? So many studies prove that if you categorize the entrepreneurs into various thresholds, a priori, you can safely assume that the entrepreneurs belong to a threshold level below a threshold of some 250 crores or something like that. So those small and medium term entrepreneurs may be paying more tax than the rich firms. So you need to understand those kind of nitty-gritties. The moment you get the result that it is on the capital more than the labor, that this instance of corporate tax is happening. So once you look into these two, the first is incidence, whether it's on capital or labor, because then the policy imperatives through the gender lens will be different. So once you look into that, then if you are getting a result that it is through the incidence is on capital, then which capital? So you have to categorize the entrepreneurs and see who is bearing the brunt of corporate tax. So once you look into all these questions, then you can apply a gender lens, whether you can go ahead with a gender differential corporate tax rate, like you promote women entrepreneurs, or it cannot be a blanket or an aggregate level tax policy when it comes to the corporate tax. So these are the different things which we need to look into the moment we talk about the gender in business taxation. And if you take a particular sector for this business taxation, say mining sector, in many countries they experimented, like in oil sector in the South African countries, they call it as cashing in on oil. Cashing in on oil means the revenue you extracted from the oil, and a part of that is earmarked for human development or for the regional development. So that is quite important. And in South Africa, there's a model called Black Economic Empowerment. So there, the interface between the race and gender, this is also looked into, because all women are not equal. We need to look into the questions of the women which are less equal, or which suffer more. So the homogeneity assumptions that all women are equal is also not working very well. So we need to experiment that interface, intersectionality issues. And in Nepal also, that intersectionality issues comes in a different manner. In India, we need to, so country-specific intersectionality issues needs to be looked into prior to that. And one experiment, as I mentioned, Black economic empowerment, then this cashing in on oil. Then another experiment is like a mineral fund, that a part of royalty, that ad valorem revenue you get from the the extractive sector, a part of that you're earmarking for human development. If suppose 12% or 13% of the royalty proceeds, because royalty proceeds is market linked, it's based on ad valorem, but where that royalty proceeds is going, whether it is used for correcting all the factors, because extractive sector means, if you apply a gender lens, you can understand the women in quarrying sector, the women who are most affected by that extractive sector. So you can understand, of course, men also, but what is that extractive revenue? Whether a portion of that is used for correcting or used for addressing the human development related concerns. So these are the questions you can look into the moment you think about business taxation. It's a brilliant question, because most of the experiments across countries in the gender budgeting happened on expenditure side and intergovernmental fiscal transfers. But we need to strengthen the questions related to the taxation side. So from that perspective, that question was very relevant. And the next question, I think it's mostly asked about the South Asian experiments, and I have covered a bit. And one thing I will again talk about this intergovernmental fiscal transfer mechanisms, like that depends on the space you have to articulate gender. For instance, in Pakistan, there are 4 provinces, and the amount of the tax transfer is devolved on the basis of the scientific formula, mostly based on the population as an indicator of devolution. So there was, many, debates that can population be the basis of devolution, because then the least populated provinces can be regionally backward provinces, because Baluchistan, where population is not like the way it is there in Sindh and Punjab, then the population, using population as the prime criterion for devolving the funds, can exacerbate the regional inequalities. So can there be some other indicators or criteria can be added to this tax transfer devolution or the grants process to equalize this, or to address the concerns of social inequality, social economic inequalities? So then in many countries, we experimented with more criteria, in the sense, of course, per capita income is important, because economic convergence is very crucial, because ultimately when we talk about what holds a nation together, that's the federal institutions, and this economic convergence is very crucial. Like the poor regions need to catch up with the rich ones. But when that economic convergence is not translating into human development, then in addition to the economic convergence, we need to look into many other indicators which can support human development directly. In that experiment, in many countries, the climate change as a part of intergovernmental fiscal transfer criterion is quite popular, the ecological fiscal transfers. So we can ask the logical step forward is, if climate concerns can be the part of fiscal policy and ecological fiscal transfers can be formulated in a country, why can't you integrate a formula related to, or a criterion related to gender concerns, and look into those questions at the jurisdictional or the subnational level? So these were the debates asked, and it is quite relevant if we look into the countries in which discrimination against women starts even before birth. in the sense, even before birth, based on the gender, the girl children, they were killed. So if we say that what gender budgeting and finance minister do about this, it's a legal question. No, money speaks, and the highest policy making authorities, when they speak about these issues, it can be quite empowering in nature. So the discrimination in South Asia, gender discrimination, that starts even before birth. Though women live more than men based on the biological advantage, but if we look into many indicators, the discrimination starts even before birth. So these questions, I think, policymakers and the budget makers, they need to look into, and they're answerable, rather than they say that it is not my cup of tea, it's illegal, you have to ensure it through legislations. No, it has to be from the a comprehensive public policy perspective. So these are quick things that came to my mind and I shared with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Let me we will end with these two questions. The one question is from Sonia Gautam. How does crisis affect gender budgeting? For instance, how COVID-19 pandemic poses a risk for gender budgeting initiatives?
Oh, great.
And, one more question, ma'am, and this will be the last questions. Another question from Alka Chaudhary. Like, many organization is committed to gender mainstreaming and ending gender discrimination, but how can gender budgeting help in achieving gender equality objectives? That's it, ma'am. These two questions, and we will end with this.
Thank you, Alka, and to your friend. There are a little bit of overlap with the questions earlier as well, but
Yeah.
let me, Sunil, the first question from Alka was, you unmute. I can't hear you. Unmute.
The first question was from Sonia Gautam. Like, how does crisis affect gender budgeting?
Absolutely. I was just trying to recollect that. That's a very important question. We have done a study to look into this economic stimulus packages through a gender lens, that how this COVID time, men and women suffer. And you know it more than me that, that women, that shadow pandemic happened. Shadow pandemic in the sense, statistics shows that, the violence against the women were on rise in the pandemic times. So that question was really very relevant. Then second is the women who lost their jobs, and the way their salaries or the remuneration or the earnings got affected. So these were important to look into. Then digital infrastructure, because when world stopped and when the world was closed, those who prospered was mainly through this digital infrastructure. But what was that digital divide? Like women and men, if you look into the digital divide, the access of women to digital infrastructure, that was quite skewed. So these were, matters of important concerns. And a crisis time, whether COVID or no COVID, macroeconomic crisis affects women. One example I can tell you, in the macroeconomic crisis times, in the social sector budget, if you go for a decision that we are going to reduce the social sector budget, for instance, health budget, then, in layman's language, the number of hospitalization days get decreased. What are the different ways in which you try to, reduce your health spending? Then, who is bearing the burden? The care provider, of that patient, from that home. But if you look into the health policies, whether crisis or no crisis, no health policies incorporate the provider's perspective, like the care provider's perspective. So that's taken for granted. That sector is in crisis, and especially when your close ailing relative is suffering from, the diseases like COVID, then, the trauma you undergo, the psychic cost, and the way, the different cost, nobody is measuring or nobody is addressing those concerns with relate to the care sector's provider, because health policy looks into only the client's perspective and not taking into account of the provider's perspective. And only in Mexico, that is even prior to the pandemic, looked into these questions of care providers' perspective within a health policy. Especially during crisis times, these became so crucial, and these are the questions we need to tackle. That's about the health. Now, education, the digital divide, it affected the education, especially of girls and those who don't have access to digital infrastructure, access to internet. So government needs to be supporting that children who are away from the digital infrastructure. That investment was quite crucial, and the gender budgeting in digital infrastructure was one of the important components at the time of pandemic. Excuse me. Then I mentioned about the shadow pandemic. There, the UN Women, Lakshmi Suri, in one meeting, she was in Geneva, UN Women, she mentioned in one of the meetings, Lakshmi mentioned a very important point, that we talk about quarantine centers those time in 2020, but this protection centers for women, that care centers, those were equally crucial, because when the world stopped and when we were asked to stay indoors, the kind of power relations happened, the kind of violence happened within that time, that was, it had, affected women, and many women may be, doing multitasking, like taking care of, especially in the households where young children were there. When the world stopped, there is no market solution. You cannot put your child anywhere. So taking care of the ailing child, taking care of the little child, taking care of the ailing relative, taking care of the household chores, as well as she's performing her duties through the digital infrastructure, her, so that her money, whatever she earns as her income is ensured. So that kind of a multitasking, when the world stopped, that created a lot of mental health issues in women. So these questions were very relevant, and some countries addressed these concerns in the economic policy packages, but the magnitude of the issue, or the depth of the issues of the problems suffered by women, whether that is addressed or not is a different question. If you look at the pandemic packages, interest rate loans were provided. Then credit infusion was given to the women in the medium term and small enterprises. Then in the household, a targeted cash transfer was given to the women in the care economy. Then energy infrastructure in India, the clean fuel was ensured. That policy was prior to the pandemic, but that was strengthened in the time of pandemic. So predominantly, if you look into the macroeconomic policy measures through a gender lens in the time of COVID pandemic, it was mainly credit-led, liquidity infusion-led. Then, like any other policies, if you look into only the supply side issues of an economy, or the credit infusion as a predominant narrative of the COVID pandemic packages, then, access can be uneven, because who will access the credit? Who are confident that they can repay, right? So women could access that when the predominant narrative of the countries, not only in South Asia, but in other countries, the economic stimulus package was credit-led. Then, who access the credit, you have to take a look into. That's why, many studies, in Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, he mentioned that the credit-related, this economic stimulus packages have limited multiplier effects. And if the predominant narrative of economic stimulus packages and that the crisis tackling package is credit-led, then, your growth recovery process can be uneven. For instance, if you look into the gender question there, okay, I have taken credit, but how I will repay? Economic activity needs to happen and my markets needs to be ensured. The demand should be stimulated in the economy. But when there is no demand stimulation, when there is no policies to stimulate demand, when the economic pandemic packages are primarily supply-led, then when I am not sure about my markets and the demand, then, how do I repay? I may go back to, I may take a good lemon, a good credit from the market, which is a part of the pandemic package, economic stimulus program. But to repay, I may go back to that money lender, that indigenous money lender in my village at a very high interest rate to repay that good credit. So it's a kind of a Ponzi finance that you're taking money at high rate of interest to repay the earlier credit or the earlier debt. So that can lead to intra-household tensions. Like when a woman takes a credit, it's a predominant responsibility of the woman to repay the credit. But who is using the credit once she takes that credit from the government? So there are different aspects to it, and we need to tackle those economic and non-economic nuances of it. Then only we will be able to answer this. But broadly, I can say that in addition to economic growth recovery packages, it's very relevant to look into social infrastructure, especially in health and education, tackling the digital divide. Then you need to look into the social security measures, guaranteeing for a finite time a cash transfer, targeted cash transfer to the women who are in the poor income households. Then you need to ensure that employer of last resort policy I mentioned. Then of course the food security, because in many countries it can lead to even civil war if in a crisis time, in a pandemic crisis time, if people are dying out of a bad public policy due to starvation deaths more than this COVID related deaths, then your government failed. So the public policy also needs to ensure food security to prevent civil war or to prevent starvation. So food security was also a major concern, as a part of this pandemic packages. So that's my question. I'll answer. And if you look into the different components, in addition to the economic growth, you need to look into various components related to the shadow pandemic, food security, social protection measures, then social infrastructure, especially health, education, employer of last resort policy. So these components in the pandemic packages, these were coming up, not only the monetary policy side, the credit policy, that story is entirely different. But in addition to that, that fiscal policy narratives, these were the important components to support, the economy. And again, I forgot that last question, Sunil.
The last question was, many organizations is committed to gender mainstreaming and ending gender discrimination, but how can gender budgeting help in achieving gender equality objectives?
Oh, good question. I can understand that because, prima facie, if a finance minister or in finance commissions, we don't discriminate men and women. We can say that budget is a prima facie gender neutral. Why should we discriminate? So that's a question you can ask, and don't do anything. But those questions were based on the equality in opportunities or the equality paradigm, like schools, hospitals, different public service provisioning, everything government provide. But you can come and access there. We don't discriminate anybody. It is equal to all. That's a narrative. But over the years, we understood that this equality in the processes by the government, that is not leading to equality in outcomes. So we need to ask the question, the equality, where we exactly need that, in the processes or in the outcomes. So that question is very relevant. So if it is in the processes, we are doing that, we are not discriminating anything. We have schools, colleges, hospitals. But the moment you look into the benefit incidence analysis, access statistics show that, many men and women didn't access these provisioning. And the role of gender budgeting is to look into the reasons of those kind of entry barriers, those kind of unfreedoms of the people, so that everybody can be participating in the economy. There, that narrative of leave nobody behind, that exactly is a narrative of gender budgeting. Then we will be able to gender mainstream it in the planning and the budgeting process. If the analytical framework is leave nobody behind, then gender mainstreaming is possible. Of course, it should not stop at the level of gender budget statement. Gender budget statement is not gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming of budget is like you need to look into the entire budget through a gender lens, not alone that gender budget statement which identified the specifically targeted programs designed by your country for women. So that's just 1% or maximum 5%. No, you need to apply what the question by Alka is gender mainstreaming. Then you have to apply a gender lens to that 99% of budget as well. There, a lot of objections or a lot of challenges are there to do that gender budgeting, and many countries have tackled that through different methodologies including this BIA process, but that political will needs to be strengthened, like looking into infrastructure, looking into the mainstream expenditure. And it is worse than asking 33 percentage that seats for women in the political space, because it is like you are asking the gender mainstreaming in the budgeting, like the budget codes which needs to be tagged to the gender concerns, and those kind of transparency you have to build into the budget framework. So those kind of experiments, that political will and the momentum we need to that needs to be strengthened so that the gender mainstreaming happened. Otherwise, in many countries called circular, yes, that revolution has happened. We just not a reality, but now that has happened. Gender budget statement is opened, but mainstreaming gender budgeting, that requires a kind of awareness of working with the classification of budgetary transactions so that you can incorporate gender, that code within the budget so that it can be made transparent and then it can be made accountable. So as a PFM tool, we need to work through all these elements, though the first two components like call circulars and gender budget statement were quite successful, but we need to take the experiment ahead so that this resources and the results can be linked even in the outcome budget. So these are the segments. There are a lot of challenges, and the countries are still working on it, that how to link the resources to the results in the outcome budgets, and even looking at the physical targets. That's it. Thank you.
Finally, here we come to the end of the discussion. Thank you, Professor Chakraborty, for the insightful presentation on gender budgeting. It was a great session. We would also like to thank our participants and audience for their wonderful questions. We still have some questions, but due to time constraints, we are not able to take all them. So have a nice day, and wish to have you all at our next upcoming sessions. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.